Let's say Base token came out today. Like, what would it trade at? I would probably conservatively think that it could probably come out at like 20 billion. I think it could probably run to like 40 or 50. It will definitely renew more interest in Base, especially when mind share across blockchains is, it's a very hard thing to capture.
That does like open up questions of do coin shareholders get some kind of claim to it? Because there is, I believe, revenue numbers that are shared on the Coinbase balance sheet based off of the Base sequencer. And so you get into some like weird areas of understanding whether or not there is some sort of claim to shareholders and they have like a fiduciary duty there. I have no idea, but that's a complicated angle.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Unchained, your no-hype resource for all things crypto. I'm your host, Laura Shin. Mantle is pioneering blockchain for banking, a revolutionary new category at the intersection of TradFi and Web3. Follow Mantle_official to learn more. Today's topic is the updates from Basecamp. They're exploring a token, which that, sent shockwaves throughout the system, even though, interestingly, I'm sure most people, if they had to bet money, they would have bet that was going to happen at some point. But here to discuss is Ryan Yee, most recently of Coinbase Ventures, and prior to that, Coin Fund. And in a little bit, we'll also be joined by ICO Beast, merchant of narratives at Proof of Play. Welcome, Ryan.
Hey, Laura. Thanks for having me.
So at Basecamp today, Jesse Pollak said that Base has to become decentralized. And he also announced that they're exploring a Base token for the first time. This is big news because for so long, they had said that they were not interested in doing that. It's even in the X bio. So what was your first reaction to hearing that they're exploring having a token?
Yeah, I think it's a very exciting development. I think that naturally as Base has grown a lot, it's obviously grown without the use of a token or a native token, which kind of goes to show you how much sort of fundamental growth on the user side and builder side that Base has been able to attract without it. And, obviously it sounds like the Base team now feels that for their next leg of growth, they have sort of a critical mass, at least of builders and liquidity on the chain that to kind of supercharge and to really compete at the largest levels, they're now exploring a token to be able to do that. So it feels like a natural evolution, but it's still, a pretty shocking thing to hear, especially from, a company like Coinbase, who's centralized and public. And, I think this is a very big move for them.
Yeah. And for them being the first crypto company in the S&P 500, there's just a lot of, regulatory things that they have on them that, kind of make it just something a bit more challenging. I mean, he kept emphasizing that they're going to do this in a regulatory compliant manner. But obviously the path for that has not been charted yet. I was curious, why do you think they're announcing that they're exploring doing a token rather than just launching one?
I think that there's probably a lot of unanswered questions on their side too. Like, as you know, launching a token is no small thing. There's a lot of details that goes into it. Allocation, utility, how do we sort of talk about this thing in public? I think there are kind of two things, right? So one is that now that users and builders are aware that there is going to be a Base token, I think you're going to have just a surge of activity that's happening. That's going to happen over Base at this time. So a lot of users paying for transactions. It's going to attract a lot more builder teams to actually deploy on top of Base. And then I think on top of that, they just released their, the new Base at TDA, which has a wait list. And I would imagine that wait list is only going to want to grow even bigger and bigger. So I think by announcing this, it will definitely renew more interest in Base, especially when mind share across blockchains is, it's a very hard thing to capture mind share. And so I think it kind of serves that purpose. And then secondly, I think there's just a lot of complex details that they're probably still trying to iron out right now. And I think the big thing too here is there is obviously regulation and legislation that's passing through the US Congress right now related to how to classify certain tokens. And so I'm sure that's an important input that they're probably waiting to see how that's going to pan out before they finalize the details of what they want to do.
Yeah, yeah, but I don't know, I still feel like I mean, they could have just launched one, but I guess maybe it's more like controlling the narrative because even if they had just decided to launch one, at some point somebody might have leaked that this was going to happen. Um, so one other thing is, he said that to kill the FUD, they were committed to building on Ethereum. And I found that interesting. The way, I mean, it's a very short clip, but the rationale he gave was something like we benefit from being part of a connected global economy. And I wondered what you thought about that decision. Like, I could argue it both ways. I could see, Ethereum obviously is not going to be going anywhere anytime soon. It's extremely decentralized. But at the same time, crypto hasn't really gone mainstream. And so, there's this competition amongst similar blockchains. And I feel like the end result of that isn't necessarily like decided. So I wondered what your thoughts were about how, they committed to building on Ethereum.
Yeah, I think it shows alignment that, I think Ethereum is definitely on its path now to becoming institutionalized as an asset and a chain, right? And so if you ask any, buddy on Wall Street right now and you ask them, what are the three things that you know about crypto? They're probably going to say Bitcoin, stable coins, and Ethereum at this point. And so, Base has been built on EVM. That's been a decision that they've made early on. And I think as Ethereum, as basically the settlement chain for all types of assets, begin to start to really take form on the Wall Street level of institutionalization, I almost see Base as kind of like the front-footed, sort of like institutional and retail BDR of Ethereum in a way, especially like in the American side of things, right? So yeah, I think the
Yeah.
benefit is obviously that they can
Oh,
grow with
I was
Ethereum.
going to say, I don't know if you
Yeah,
remember on the chopping block, Tarun, he basically said at one point, he was like, oh, it's B&B for white people. But anyway,
no comment.
but keep going. I cut you off.
No, just to say that I think Ethereum has continued to have critical mass among developers, and so Base is obviously contributing to that, and so it's more of like we might as well align on the thing that's already working, and with us now, this thing becomes bigger collectively.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious how you think they're going to launch. Actually, before we get there, what do you think the token allocation will look like? Or what do you think it should look like? So two questions. What do you think it will look like and what do you think it should look like?
Yeah, so I think at the very least, if you look at a typical token project's allocation, it's really divided between three people. So one is the team itself. The second is the early backers and the treasury. And then the third is the community. So I think if you were to take that analogy towards Base token, it's pretty one-to-one, right? I would expect that a large portion of it would probably be held by Coinbase on their balance sheet.
Define large. Is that
I'd probably
like
say anywhere
20%?
between like 20 to 40%, I would guess. I would say that there's probably an additional 20% held by like an independent treasury, which is managed between the Base team, Coinbase, and the other participants in the community. And then I think the rest will go to the broader community, whether that's through a public sale, whether that's through airdrops, whether that's through sort of a continuous distribution method. But yeah, I would guess that over time you basically build enough ownership to, especially by Coinbase's side, to incentivize Coinbase to continue to provide value and provide flows on top of Base.
And so when you say, because initially you started by saying like the team and then the investors and the ecosystem. So like, are you putting Coinbase in the investor bucket or the team bucket?
So it's basically both. I think it will depend on kind of like how the Base team actually ends up spinning out, whether as like an independent entity or not. I think the way that I would probably think about it in the first way is that there's maybe formally there is like some spin out that happens at the entity level. Potentially that entity will probably continue to be a subsidiary under Coinbase in some capacity. And then Coinbase will probably have some, internal compensation plan related to the base tokens that Coinbase owns. And then they basically are able to distribute that to the team. So when I use the word Coinbase here, this is more all encompassing because that also includes the team allocation as well. That's probably how I would think about it.
And I guess like you're saying like Base might be spun out. So like, what do you think that could look like? And if that were to happen, you still feel like Coinbase would keep like some portion of the tokens? Or just talk about that.
Yeah, exactly. So, up until this point, Coinbase has been, funding the team of Base, right? Whether that's their salaries and tech costs and all these things. They're basically treated as like another internal product group at Coinbase. So I would imagine that continues in terms of the relationship between, Base as like a product team or like as a team in general in relation to Coinbase. It's just that, they're probably going to, instead of thinking through traditional, like, getting paid through Coinbase equity or something like that, that probably changes to something that's more in line with, distributing Base tokens. And so I think there's that angle. There's also another angle here where maybe the Base team actually does spin out as like an independent entity fully. And then, maybe Coinbase does own them 100% as a separate entity. And then they still have this like formal relationship between, you guys are building on Base, helping hit certain KPIs, helping hit certain, metrics that we hold you to. And then that's related to the amount of budget that we're willing to give you from a cash perspective or like a token perspective. But, I think like the details, like TBD, but I think at a very high level functionally, you should just think of this as like, the Base team continuing what they're doing right now, but then kind of being treated as this arm's length project related to Coinbase.
Okay. And basically you think that that's how they'll quote unquote decentralize Base. Like they'll make it sort of like the Uniswap labs of Base or something, like the front end. Is that what you're saying? Okay.
Yeah, probably.
And you're just like why is it that you're saying that and are you saying that you think that's likely or just like a possibility? Like how, where is this coming from?
I mean, it's just based on looking at how most startups, I think, in the crypto space are effectively structured today, right? So I feel like at most startups, especially the US startups, they have, what is like an offshore foundation that actually issues the token and manages the community. And then you have the onshore team, which is usually some equity company like a Delaware, like C Corp or something like that. And that is the entity that owns all the IP. That's the entity that all the team is employed under, and they're the ones that are actually building products and the roadmap, right? And so I would imagine that this probably has something that looks very similar, where the Base team as is like the Base Labs or Base Equity entity, like whatever you want to call it. Like that's probably still, has a formal relationship in terms of ownership to Coinbase, the parent organization. But then the actual token, how that decides to get issued, I don't know. But, that might be through like some offshore entity. But that offshore entity would probably be issuing tokens, of which that allocation would be going to Coinbase, and then Coinbase manages how those Base tokens are distributed internally.
And okay, but why are you saying offshore entity? Like, at least the way that I was interpreting some of Jesse's remarks about how they want to do this in a compliant manner and everything is like, I thought they were basically saying we're going to be lobbying for, like the Clarity Act is coming up, right? So like, I assumed that they're saying like, because like Coinbase has a huge presence in DC, like we all know they're very influential there, or recently influential. They haven't always been. But the point is that like, my thought was like, the rules around all of this are they haven't been hammered out, but they are being hammered out. And they could be hammered out in a way that would enable Coinbase to spin out Base in this way, and potentially then that would be how Base would decentralize. What do you think of my hypothesis?
Yeah, I think that's completely right. Like I don't think this token launches until Clarity Act is signed into law. I think that is the big, if I had to think about like from a timing perspective, that's probably one of the biggest catalysts. I know that right now Clarity got passed in the House, but it needs to go through the Senate, and it's also like unclear, even if this does become legislation, there's probably some buffer period after that in which like these laws can actually start to be enacted. But, just as a TLDR of like the high level drop, I'm not, a lawyer or regulator or anything, but just based on my read of it, it effectively establishes, hey, like what is, there are tokens, and on one side there are commodities and there are securities. Where in that spectrum does this token basically lie? And I think based on the different rules or the different sort of guidance that Clarity might give for those goalposts, that should be able to give a much better sense of, what type of token do we actually want to launch as Base? And therefore, what does that actually mean in terms of the setup that's required around the rules of decentralization that might then basically impact how we would actually go about, the entity structuring or the allocation structuring or like the token structuring, right? So my feeling is that they want to make this token as, quote unquote, decentralized as possible, which means they want to make this token as the furthest away from what would be traditionally called like a security token, like, so like a tokenized security or like a tokenized stock. They definitely probably don't want this to be in that side of the spectrum. They definitely want this to be more in the spectrum of, what we would call like a traditional like utility token, like ETH or these other tokens like L2 tokens, L1 tokens that are out there.
Right. Yeah. That it makes a lot of sense. So let's now also talk about, um, how we think they're going to launch this. You kind of mentioned, like the Base app, which, obviously would be a great way to then design some kind of airdrop. And ICO Beast, who's going to be on the show in a little bit, said, and this is not something I have been able to confirm. So, he basically said that this is a quote unquote leak that he got from Basecamp and X.com. So, TBD on the veracity of that. But he's saying, and this is not out of the realm of either possibility or even, just common sense. He said Base is going to be launching a points farming campaign in Q4 2025, including Base Blue. He also said hearing rumors of NFT stats bringing back his prediction arc for value estimates. So anyway, so what do you think would be the optimal way for Coinbase to launch this token? Whether airdrop or ICO or something else.
Yeah, it's probably going to be a combination of those two things, right? So there's like three aspects of this. I think one is how do you distribute tokens to builders, right? And I think that'll probably be measured by some amount of like transactions or the amount of gas consumed by your application on top of Base. And we could probably run stats as to like which those projects are, and they will probably be given some allocation for being early to Base and building out the ecosystem. I think the second is, I'm just going off of what what you were saying in terms of this report. I have no knowledge of this, but it does make sense to me that their goal would probably be to really make TBA and the Base app the sort of, the consumer front end of Base. And so they're likely going to use that as like the main consumer and user funnel to really grow and own the relationship that they have with the consumers. And then, yeah, a points campaign completely makes sense to me, like through that interface. And so, that's probably more of the user side of things. And then lastly, I think the way that I would think about this one is, I think lately, at least like on a public sale aspect, I do think that's probably going to happen. So if you think about, a lot of people have been comparing Coinbase and Robinhood to each other. And if you look at Robinhood, they have this product where you can basically go earlier in the life cycle and invest in IPOs now, right? So when IPOs come out, like as a user, you can basically join that and fundraise through that mechanism. I think they also now like are announcing stuff where like you can even invest like pre-IPO, like, in the sort of secondary rounds, like late stage UC rounds. I would imagine, if you look at projects that exist today in crypto, that's beginning to happen, right? Like that ICO sort of crowdfunding platform Meta is kind of back now with projects like Legion and Echo. And I think Echo is like it's a pretty big project on Base. Like,
and then I think they have like Sonar.
Yeah, exactly. So I would imagine that they take that product in order to run, what would be like the biggest like ICO sale for Base tokens through a Coinbase or something like that. And that would be their answer to like a Robinhood style product, but in a way that is crypto native and Coinbase native. And because it's Base token, like, you want to come out with a bang, and this obviously would be like the biggest like raise or the most interesting raise to like actually want to be a part of.
Yeah, I love this. So ICO Beast has joined us. So we are going to take a very quick word from our sponsors, but I'm sure he will have a lot to say about what Ryan just said. So we will hear from him in a moment. Mantle leads the establishment of blockchain for banking as the next frontier. UR is the access layer that transforms Mantle Network into a purpose-built vertical platform, the blockchain for banking, that enables financial services on-chain. UR unifies and vertically aligns Mantle's focus on payments, trading, and assets. MI4, METH protocol, functions FBTC, supported by developer grants, ecosystem incentives, and the industry-leading distribution platform through the UR app, Reward Station, and Bybit Launch Pool. All economic activity within UR will be captured by Mantle Network to further drive value to token holders and establish its significance in blockchain for banking. Follow Mantle_official to learn more. All right, so we're back now, and ICO Beast has joined us. Welcome, ICO Beast. And I'll just remind everybody, he is the merchant of narratives at Proof of Play. Welcome.
Hey, Lauren, thanks for having me. Pretty big day for the Base ecosystem.
I know. I said at the beginning of the show that this was, quote unquote, big news. And yet I'm sure if everybody had to bet money, they would have all bet that this was going to happen. So, I'm curious, like obviously we're just talking about all these details around like, how are they going to sell it? What's the allocation going to be, et cetera. But I'd be curious just for your, like initial reaction when you heard this news.
Yeah, so my initial reaction was I knew it, which I think a lot of people they were kind of in that same boat. Although I posted a little bit about it back into 24 and early 25, just because I was really active on Base trading virtuals and a whole bunch of other tokens there. I was like, I bet you that we'll have like really great wallets for this airdrop. And a bunch of people were like, there's never going to be an airdrop. Why would they do it since they have a stock? And it's not really like understanding that Base and Coinbase are not the same entity. But so I was excited to hear it. I think it's really interesting. I am a little bit curious that they like gave themselves a lot of wiggle room by saying that we are exploring the idea of a token, which I think everybody wants to read between the lines there. But they have like tons of wiggle room to like delay, or if they really felt like they had to at some point, they could even pivot away from it and never do it because they're exploring. And so it's an interesting thing. I think the announcement was crafted well, just to give them the flexibility to operate how they want to going forward.
Yeah, so I have not been following super closely what's going on with the Clarity Act, but in my head I was like, oh, maybe it's just that the negotiations are going well enough that they feel they can at least use this language. Like they have more than 50% confidence that they will be able to actually launch this. But because it's not a done deal, clarity hasn't passed, that's why, they chose this word exploring. That was sort of how I read this sort of like split the baby, way of announcing. So we're going to get to the question that we had been discussing with Ryan, but I did also want to ask before we get there, just do you have any thoughts on like what you think the token allocation should look like? Because Ryan and I were also discussing that before you joined, and I was just curious to hear, what you thought that should look like.
That's such a tough one because airdrops are a really hot topic right now. There's been a lot of discourse, especially on crypto Twitter the last week or so, about what airdrops' purpose are and kind of what they should look like. I would hope that it would be largely to users, but also like we know that if you give too many tokens out to users, then your chart looks really bad because everybody wants to sell it. So I don't know. I think it probably, if it's following the Base ethos that I feel like we've all kind of watched play out over the last year or so, it'll be heavy towards builder incentives. So people actually building things on Base or using the Base app, mini apps, or like really generating a lot of people showing up in the Base ecosystem. So virtuals brought a bunch of people in. You've got airdrop, obviously a huge protocol on Base. Like I imagine there'll be pretty solid allocations for people that have brought users into Base and are going to continue doing that going forward.
Yeah. Ryan's guess was Coinbase would retain maybe like 20 to 40% of the tokens. Like, what do you agree with that? Or if you don't have like a number, what do you think of Ryan's number that he was thinking?
I think that's a totally reasonable amount because I mean I've been thinking today just how exactly like what a network token even means for them, and so I have to assume that in some ways it's going to benefit from sequencer revenue or other network effects. And if that's the case, you'd expect them to retain a decent chunk of the token just to have claim to a large amount of the sequencer revenue. So I mean that seems entirely reasonable. Also, like if they are allocating a good chunk for themselves, in my opinion, that signals a pretty good thing for the token price. Because you wouldn't expect Coinbase to get a huge chunk of this thing and then just immediately nuke a chart. So I'd feel more comfortable with them having a decently large supply than say giving 40% of the community because you know what's going to happen if you do that.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about how they might launch it. You have this name ICO Beast. We were just talking about the airdrop as well. But I was wondering like what you thought would be the optimal way for them. And it doesn't even have to be just like this initial sale or whatever it is that they end up doing, but like over time. And then we can talk about things like the utility, like what is going to be the utility of this token. But first, what do you think would be the optimal way for them to launch this token?
I kind of wish that they hadn't even announced it and then just did the Arbitrum method of saying, all right, here's a token today. At the same time, I think that they like ultimately the most successful airdrop, in my opinion, is going to be one that aggressively symbol filters, and that's either voluntary or done via bounty. So either let people link all of their wallets together, and let that then act as a single entity under all those wallets. And we've got so many privy wallets these days and other like burners that we've set up for various applications. Everybody's got tons of wallets on these networks, or you end up putting out a bounty for catching symbol clusters, like Layer Zero did and a few others have, and incentivize hunting people that are doing that to maybe increase your share or get a bounty. Basically, just because you really do want like really widely distributed tokens, especially if it's to increase a network effect or to like help give ownership of the network or really decentralize it. And so symbols, while they're like very clever and good at what they do, it ends up kind of confounding that purpose. So I think it's going to have to be something that really cleverly deals with the fact that we've all got a bunch of wallets operating on these networks.
Yeah, that's such a good point. My mind was blown because Brian Pellegrino came on the show during that period, and he basically said that they were finding like these civil operations of, I forget the number. It was, I think he said like 50,000 or 75,000 wallets that were all like one person's one entity's operation. And I was just like, wow, okay, that's insane. Hopefully I didn't get those numbers wrong. Anyway, okay, so now we've kind of caught up, like, because now you've answered the same questions that Ryan did. But I'd be curious for both of you to talk about like, what do you think the utility of the base token should be?
My guess is that I think Ethereum and ETH and the properties that that token has are very similar to the types of things base token will probably do, right? And so there's probably some level of, basically the amount of profits that you're generating as a chain through fees, and in Base's case, it's sequencer revenue. I would imagine that there's some percentage of that that's basically being burned in real time in basically as like a ratio or relation to the amount of like fees that Base is actually generating. So I think that basically gives almost like a baseline on how to value Base token just in terms of like a productive asset. I think the second thing that we'll probably see with Base token, if it ever launches, is it'll likely take on a lot of the similar properties as the main sort of DeFi liquidity asset on top of Base. So if you look at sort of how USDC has been treated by Coinbase on top of Base, you'll notice that there's a lot of perks that come with it, right? So if you hold USDC on Base, I believe or spend USDC, you actually don't have to pay any gas fees right now with USDC. The other thing too is obviously it's like one of the largest assets and liquidity pairs that exists on top of Base DeFi. And then lastly, I believe there's like some opt-in where I think you can receive like rewards, like 4% interest if you hold USDC like on top of Base as well. So, when you look at something like that, that basically shows you the types of benefits that come with a token that Coinbase is effectively behind or sponsoring, right? Even though USDC is a stable coin, I effectively view it as a token that is by Coinbase, right? And so then if you just take that analogy and you apply it to Base token, you can pretty much see like a lot of the similar strategies that they probably employ on top of here, right? So I would imagine like the largest, all the tokens that end up listing on Base, I'm sure like it just makes more sense to just pair that with like a Base or like pair that with like a USDC over pairing it with like a ETH or like a wrapped ETH asset, for example.
So you're viewing it more like a rewards token, but then do you feel like, because how Jesse hinted that they want to decentralize, do you feel like then at a certain point in the future it might even be used for governance? I didn't know if there was any connection between the fact that he was saying that at some point they plan to decentralize, and if you think the token might be related to that or not.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure governance is within the realm of possibility here. My feeling though is, even if you look at the governance of like the largest sort of blockchain ecosystems, it's still a very messy thing, right? And I think generally speaking, when you're thinking about governance, what part of the roadmap are you actually opening up to the community, right? And I think that's a very core question. My sense is that because something like Base is extremely integral to how Coinbase is thinking about its on-chain future, I would never imagine that like Coinbase or Base wants to open up extremely important product or engineering decisions to the community, right? Like that's things that they want to own and they want to basically control. And so, yes, there probably will be governance, but I wouldn't expect there to be governance over extremely material product or engineering decisions.
Yeah, and I only meant like potentially years down the road or something. Like I could see it starting as a rewards thing and then evolving over time, and especially if they do end up truly decentralizing it. But I agree, like right now it's mostly decentralization theater we see in crypto.
Let me mention two other things too. So
Okay.
one is, I think when you have a token that, let's say Base token came out today, like what would it trade at? I would probably conservatively think that it could probably come out at like 20 billion. I think it could probably run to like 40 or 50. When you have that, you can now do all sorts of like crazy growth campaigns. You could do investments. You can even do M&A of token projects, right? And so it opens this entirely new balance sheet strategy for Base. And then I think the other thing too is that for the governance aspect, one thing that's very interesting in the draft of the Clarity Act is I think it basically labels no one person can own more than like, I think the number is like 20%. I need to read the draft again, but no one person can hold more than 20% governance power within like an ecosystem. And so I would imagine that, even though let's say Coinbase collectively might own more than 20% of the token, they probably will be trying to delegate that across different actors across the ecosystem in order to basically pass that decentralization test. And so, there's probably going to be like big community members, like, whether that's the Base team, Coinbase team, the biggest Base builders, like the biggest DeFi projects, all those kinds of things. Like they will have to open the community up and like have that actually represented in terms of the governance power. But as to whether or not that actually ends up impacting big decisions on product roadmap from a governance perspective is still very TBD.
Okay, ICO.
Yeah, this one's a really complicated question because there's a number of ways they could go about it. Like if they end up influencing like where revenue goes from the sequence or any case, that does like open up questions of do coin shareholders get some kind of claim to it, because there is, I believe, revenue numbers that are shared on the Coinbase balance sheet based off of the Base sequencer, and so you get into some like weird areas of understanding whether or not there is some sort of claim to shareholders and they have like a fiduciary duty there. I have no idea, but that's a complicated angle. I saw A16Z crypto kind of quoted themselves in an article they wrote a couple months ago about token taxonomy today, mentioning network tokens and app tokens in the same classification. So app tokens are an interesting angle because you end up basically using those as kind of vouchers or in-app or just in-network tokens specifically don't necessarily have extrinsic value, but they're used as basically trading chips inside the things that you're developing. So that doesn't seem quite as appealing to me as an airdrop recipient, because I want something that could go to 20 or 40 billion. But that's an interesting way of looking at it as well. If they want to do some sort of capture and basically turn into their own version of Base USD, but that doesn't make sense because of other Coinbase interests. So I don't know. They may actually really just be in the early stages of exploring it and are kind of feeling everything out. I Would be interested to see it function similar as like a liquidity token, like Ryan was saying, because that is pretty interesting. I don't know how they would do it without cannibalizing some of the other DeFi protocols necessarily. So there's a lot of question marks here for me, to where at like day one, I'm not sure if I have a good handle on what they really could do to make this a valuable token without also like going against other competing interests.
I mean, yeah, I don't know if this is like something too far afield, like if they would feel like they're screwing over their own users, but you could even imagine them like, it's sort of like this protocol native stablecoin issue that like, obviously we saw that with Hyperliquid, the competition for just a certain ticker became so fierce. But Mega ETH, they also announced a protocol native stablecoin, and Shu Yao was just on the show saying like she thinks this is going to be the future, that like everybody's going to do this. And so you could see them potentially wanting to like bake in sort of certain things to the base protocol that are sort of native, not only a stablecoin, but use the base token to facilitate that. I don't know, I'm just spitballing, but I was also wondering because like, it's not only that. So okay, they at the same time, and this is something that Ryan and I also discussed, but we didn't ask you ICO yet. Jesse also said that they're going to commit to building on Ethereum, and I just wondered what your thoughts were about that.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I'd like to think that all the L2s are aligned, and they all are going to end up being value accretive for Ethereum. In practice, I don't know if that actually is going to happen in the long run, but I do believe that like the core ethos of Base is aligned with Ethereum right now. Is that is part of the question about token too, is like if it ends up being a gas token or something of a substitute there, or like even a validator style token, you have to stake it or something, then it does start to bring up questions of, so is the revenue from the sequencer that normally would, like you would hope in the end state, be going back to help basically pay rent for living atop of Ethereum, like are those things aligned? I don't know. But it's good to hear them affirming that they're planning to do that. I think that's kind of the gamble that Ethereum took when it went on this roll up scaling journey, was that the L2s wouldn't actually end up just like spinning off and doing their own thing later on. So hopefully that's the outcome. But it's good to hear that's at least what they're verbalizing at this stage.
All right, and then let's also now talk about the fact that, so they also announced at the same time that they're integrating with Solana. Apparently, they've already done this in testnet, and I wondered, do you feel like, what do you think of the fact that they're doing that? Like, I don't know how good of an experience it will be, and I was just curious what you thought it meant for this sort of like Ethereum Solana competition that we've been seeing play out for a while.
Yeah, I mean, I'll have to see how it feels in practice. I think that we're all like acutely aware of the issues of liquidity fragmentation and the complication of having things spread out across a whole bunch of different chains and layers. And like eventually somebody will have some extremely useful, very like smooth, unified liquidity layer where you're doing something on chain, whatever that means exactly, and nobody, like, you don't know which chain you're using. It's all abstract away from the end user. We haven't gotten there, and like I don't really know how soon we're gonna get there, but I feel like I haven't seen a ton of like cross-chain EVM to SVM scenarios. Like normally you have to push funds across via Synapse or Relay or one of these other protocols, and there's no like real native integration between the two. So that's interesting, and I'm very curious to see what the user experience is like. The second and third order effects are hard to know until you see like how good the user experience is. If it really is like super seamless, then it ends up being interesting to see which chain the value actually ends up accruing to. And I think that depends on which chain is actually exporting their native token more. I think Totally seems to think that Solana is going to be the one doing that. They'll be shipping it to Ethereum mainnet and various L2s. I don't know if that's the case or not, but that ends up being, I think, the operative question, the more interesting place to focus, if the experience is truly seamless.
Ryan?
Yeah, I think my view of that is it's just Base admitting that Solana is its biggest competition. If you think about, like, seriously, like if you talk to any of like the biggest projects in the space, especially those that are deploying on Base, they admit that like Solana is the only other chain that they would actually consider like building on top of, which is a big step for a lot of these projects because these are two extremely different tech stacks, and that's a big cost to actually like think about as a project. But projects are like willing to entertain that because, that's kind of with it. That's like a positive ROI decision for them because that's just how strong Solana is. I think my view here is there's like liquidity / DeFi on one side, and then there's consumers on the other side. I would actually say that Solana probably has a better consumer aspect and a user aspect right now, and a user culture. If you look at everything that's happening on Pump and anything that has like a more normie, like Gen Z, like if they're using any crypto app, it's probably on Solana. Like that's what's happening right now. And if you compare that to Base, I think Base obviously has users, but it's definitely more DeFi and liquidity centric. And I actually think that that's the best part of Base is all the DeFi and liquidity projects. And it makes sense because Coinbase is a financial services company. And that's why all the core products that would be popular on Base would naturally result out of that. So whether that's like the Bitcoin loans that are on Morpho or like the DEX trading that they're thinking about doing on airdrop or, channeling to Base on chain, that makes sense. So I think in a way it's like, if you think about liquidity today, yes, like Solana has 12 billion TVL and Base has 5 billion TVL, right? So Solana is leading. But I think in like 3-4 years, I could easily see Base's like, DeFi liquidity probably matching Solana or even outcompeting because they have the introduction and the on-ramp that Coinbase brings to it. Now, what Base doesn't have compared to Solana is as strong of like the user and consumer culture. And so I think by doing this, what they're really saying is like, hey, like, if you're a project that's considering deploying on Solana, now you could deploy on Base if you want to access more liquidity or considering like growth from like an EVM perspective. And I think vice versa, if there are projects on Base that are considering leaving to Solana, which has happened in the past, now they don't necessarily have to leave Base completely. They can sort of tap into Solana as a second option. But I think like at a high level takeaway when I saw that, it's like, oh, like, yeah, Base is paranoid of Solana and like Solana is the biggest competition for them. And so I think this is their way of basically being able to get the builders and the developer funnel and access both ecosystems at once.
Yeah, I'm sure you guys saw, I can't remember who tweeted this, but this tweet went around where someone was like, oh, if you remove the L1s and stable coins, then, all the biggest apps are on Solana. And so, that points to what you were talking about, like just the user experience. But then what was interesting was, because like obviously if you look at DeFi, then obviously Ethereum dominates in DeFi. But and I think like at some point in the Twitter conversation, like somebody pointed that out, or I forget, but like Kyle Samani wrote back like, oh, with my debt, we're going to be deploying our Sol into DeFi to boost Sol DeFi and bring more liquidity there. So I was like, we could see a lot more competition between Ethereum and Solana DeFi coming up, which, or maybe, I don't know, what do you guys think? Do you think that's possible or likely or?
Yeah, so I think it's the right strategy, but the problem is that I think Ethereum right now is just so much more ahead when it comes to DeFi and liquidity, right? Look at the two other biggest players that are entering EVM. It's Robinhood and Stripe, right? Like, and so my question is, what is the Robinhood for Solana? Who is the Stripe player for Solana? Who is the Coinbase player for Solana? I don't think they really have that yet. Right. And so that's why you have the big VCs that have backed Solana, obviously, putting together these structures for Wall Street liquidity to enter Solana. That's great, but that's not product, right? Like product is like you need an actual front end that is bringing users and new liquidity into your ecosystem. And so far, I haven't seen that happen for Solana yet. But, that's mostly happened on the Ethereum side. But what I do give Solana credit for is like they've gotten this far without that at all, which is actually like really, really impressive. And like they deserve accolades for it. And the community is like, okay, well, if we're not getting like institutional liquidity, like let's just make our own liquidity, right? Like let's make our own pump tokens. Let's like, let's just figure this stuff out by ourselves. And that's awesome. But I do think in like a 5 to 10 year horizon, I think my question is, who is that centralized player that is really bringing that new liquidity into Solana right now? And that's a big question mark. I don't actually know what that is.
I think I super agree with that take because I mean you've got Coinbase utilizing things like Morpho for yield on CBBTC, and you've got Aave that lives on Ethereum obviously and has been like battle tested, and there's some serious deposits there. I think that I saw they're up to like 77 billion TVL or something, which is crazy. And so you have these institutional partners and massive liquidity that has been built up over years on Ethereum, and it like throwing liquidity in the system is part of the solution, but it's not the only solution. Like on Solana, you've got things like Meteora, which I love as a DeFi product. I don't expect to see institutions LPing meme coins on DLMs. That just doesn't make much sense to me. But so like it's a great product. I don't know if they have the institutional champion yet to like really fully utilize it, or if it even scales up to that style of usage. Because it's great for what the primary use case on Solana is right now. But will that be the primary use case to attract like real top tier blue chip players? I don't know.
Okay. So I'm so curious about this because I sort of feel like we're seeing this big competition. It's like some kind of like huge competition is about to start, and we're seeing all these players line up, right? So there's so many different ones here that I could throw in the mix. So, you know, some of the names that we've discussed are like obviously Coinbase, Base, and I'm talking about the on-chain competition. So, you know, Coinbase via Base, Robinhood, who we mentioned, there's Solana and all of its sort of user-facing apps. There's, I don't know, like Binance, Telegram, even the stablecoin issuers, Tether, Solana. And then there's also Hyperliquid, which has just, you know, skyrocketed to a very, very important position. Everybody can kind of see like it's not even on the verge. It's like already doing it. So I'm curious, like, you know, how do you think this big competition where, you know, you see all these players lining up with their different strengths, how do you think that will play out? And I'd be interested to hear from both of you, and either one of you can go first.
Oh man, I think if I knew the answer to that, I would be perfectly positioned for the next 5 years of crypto. And I definitely don't know the answer, so I've got exposure to all of it. Just because I think that like crypto as a whole is only going to continue expanding. Like my thoughts are, we're not going to see Solana companies or Ethereum companies or even crypto companies in the next 3 years or so. It's just going to be companies, and they're going to be using crypto rails for pieces that make sense, and not using it for pieces that don't. So I think that, for me at least, it just means having exposure to everybody that is lining up, and let the chips fall, because I think that like having exposure is how you win in this situation.
Ryan?
Yeah, ultimately, I think, you know, crypto's financial technology, and the core product of crypto is tokens at the end of the day. And so I think as long as you're in the business of we have the most tokens being generated on our chain, and we have the most volume and flows on those tokens as a result, I think the combination of those two things basically would determine who wins this race, right? You know, Solana's version of that is, you have the meme coins, and that's great. And Base's version of that is all the Coinbase liquidity that's coming onto Base, right? And so I think, and Hyperliquid obviously is all the, you know, the on-chain perps markets for the broader crypto space. And so this is ultimately like the two sort of vectors I would consider as like the most important things going forward. I think the question then remains like, what identity do you want to take across those two vectors? And I think I view Solana very much as, let's increase just the number of quantity of tokens that we have, and then let's bet that eventually over time, like we can produce a lot more sort of volumes with scale over time. Whereas I think in the Base aspect, it's like, okay, like I think we can bring tokens that have a lot of volume scale, like, you know, the wrapped Coinbase, Bitcoin, or like USDC or something like that. But how do we create an economy where there are a ton of tokens being issued on our chain right now? And that's why they're experimenting with things like creator coins and all this other stuff right now that's happening. And so, yeah, you're in the business of tokenization if you're a chain, and, you know, those are the two ways that you probably need to win.
All right, Ryan and ICO, thank you so much for joining this conversation.
Thanks, Lana.
Thank you. Unchained is produced by Laura Shin with help from Matt Pilchard, Juan Aranovich, Margaret Curia, and Pam Majumdar. Thanks for listening.